Hello, class. This is your friendly neighborhood lecturer, Joe, for religion and science. And I will be posting up a very brief lecture on hyperdarwinism for you today. And I will post up one more lecture later this week or early next week on environmental theology, where we see religion and theology intersect with environmental study, or environmental science, and climate change. Promises to be interesting, for sure. Today, for the next few minutes, I hope it also promises to be interesting enough. The lecture is relevant for your final exam essay, and you're all asked to write on Richard Dawkins. And he is probably the public face, if I could put it that way, of hyper-Darwinism or ultra-Darwinism. So I want to spend just a few minutes on addressing what that means, what that movement is, and a couple of the figures responsible for popularizing the notion of Darwinism as a kind of universal philosophy, so to speak. So the two main figures in the English-speaking world would be Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins. Both have written on Darwin at length. The best book on the whole movement, no doubt, is Daniel Dennett's book, which I'll put up on loop if it's not already there. I'll put them up under the lecture slides. The best book is Darwin's Dangerous Idea. It's a 500-page book on Darwinism and how Darwinism is a kind of quasi-ideology or religion or philosophy or metaphysics or something like that. So it's more than just a scientific theory. It can actually shape how we see and feel about our own sense of self and the world around us. The other major book is what you're reviewing, is the book that sold over a couple million copies, written by Richard Dawkins over 10 years ago now. I think it's 12 years ago, 2008, maybe 2007, I forget, called The God Delusion. And here you'll see Darwinism, and Darwin makes a regular appearance in that book. The Daniel Dennett book is from the mid-90s, so it's one of the first, 1995, 94, one of the first major philosophical takes or interpretations of Darwin and Darwinism. So what is, in a nutshell, hyper-Darwinism? Well, the adjective hyper or ultra simply means that Darwinism is converted into an ideology or a philosophy that can enable us to adjudicate or arbitrate truth claims. So Darwinism, typically, without the ultra or the hyper attached to it, Darwinism typically is a rather revolutionary, of course, but modest thesis about how natural selection occurs in the animal kingdom, including us, given that we're animals. So it gets controversial, Darwinism does, when it starts to talk about human evolution and natural selection there, and genetic selection. But as we talked about, Teilhard de Chardin, the French theologian and archaeologist, easily subsumed evolution and Darwinism within a Christian worldview, saying this is how God creates. God gives it a certain logic and direction and pulls evolution according to divine providence in this way or that way. And I still think Chardin's thesis of theistic evolution is the best response, against hyperdarwinism. So hyperdarwinism goes beyond just plain Darwinism. It elevates Darwinism into a kind of critique of any kind of religious or theological sensibility, any kind of theism. Dennett and Dawkins in particular think Darwinism can be leveled against theism and thus give us every reason to not believe in God. So hyperdarwinism would be atheistic in its tone, and it can be quite aggressive against religion. It's a kind of metaphysic that critiques Christian metaphysics or theological metaphysics or any religious metaphysics, doesn't have to be Christian. And it tends to be a little bit nihilistic. What do I mean by nihilistic? It tends to eliminate the notion that there is ultimate meaning or actually any kind of objective meaning or a higher purpose or something like that. Or sometimes it's called teleology, that there's some kind of end or final end to which we're moving. So hyperdarwinism tends to be a myth breaker. It tries to say religion is a myth, and let's bust or break this myth. Let's look at our life and the world around us with eyes wide open and stop coming under the illusion that there is a God who is providentially involved in our, in the kind of daily traffic of our experience of the world. One of the best quotes that I'm going to read out loud comes from Daniel Dennett. I just have to read this quote. The slides are there for you to peruse, and I'm only really covering the first 8 or 10 slides here. So Darwin's dangerous idea, the Dennett book, says this. It's a really powerful slide. He says, "Did you ever hear of universal acid?" This is page 63 on Darwin's dangerous idea. So did you ever hear of universal acid? Universal acid is a liquid so corrosive that it will eat through anything. The problem is, what do you keep it in? It dissolves glass bottles and stainless steel. Would the whole world be destroyed by this acid? What would it leave in its wake after everything had been transformed by its encounter with the universal acid? What would the world look like? Little did I realize that in a few years I would encounter an idea, Darwin's idea, bearing an unmistakable likeness to universal acid. It eats through just about every traditional concept, and it leaves in its wake a revolutionized worldview, with most of the old landmarks still recognizable, but transformed in fundamental ways. If redesign could be a mindless, algorithmic process of evolution, why couldn't that whole process itself be the product of evolution all the way down? Darwin's idea also threatened, and this is important, to spread all the way up, dissolving the illusion of our own authorship, our own divine spark of creativity and understanding, close quote. So that's a very powerful statement of the kind of demythologization, it's a mouthful, that Dennett and Dawkins and hyperdarwinism wants to advance against religious metaphysics. Okay, and so hyperdarwinism is itself not neutral. It's not a scientific theory. It is itself a kind of metaphysics or philosophy or theology. By metaphysics, I just mean a kind of non-neutral standpoint, where you take up a position that's value-laden and not objective or neutral, because I don't think there's any such thing as neutrality anyway. But there is a kind of pretense here to hyperdarwinism that it pretends that it's completely scientific and rigorously objective. But it's not at all. It's an ideology like any other ideology. It's a philosophy that's laden with values and assumptions and standpoints like any other philosophy. Doesn't always acknowledge that, though. And the universal acid of Darwinism, that's how it's framed by hyperdarwinists, is a universal acid in that it tries to say, and it tries to claim over and over and over, okay, that natural selection and evolution is mindless, that has no direction. It's just an algorithm and a process that runs its course, and whatever happens, happens. There's a kind of arbitrary mindlessness to it. And maybe there is something to that. That's a properly scientific outlook that tries to bracket questions of meaning and direction. And one way to understand it as a mindless algorithm is to imagine a tennis tournament, very basic bracket, where you have a Final Four, and then you have 2, and then you have a champion. So you have 4 tennis players in a bracket. Okay, pick your favorite 4, and then 4 of them play, and 2 of them are eliminated. and then you get a final two, and then they play, and one of them is eliminated, and you get a champion. Okay, now the process is it always works from 4 to 2 to 1 with a champion. Okay, it's always that way. That's a kind of universal, timeless principle, the algorithm itself. But what is not universal or necessary is the content of the algorithm. So Roger Federer could win 1 year. Then you could have Pete Sampras win 1 year if he comes back. You could have Nadal win 1 year. You could have Djokovic win 1 year. You could have Joe Rivera win 1 year. I guess it's possible after billions of tries over billions of years, right? So the content is completely unpredictable. It's mindless. It doesn't care who wins or who the players are. What it cares about, and this is evolution as an algorithm, is that it goes from 4 to 2 to 1, always and forever, over and over and over. And so this kind of mindless algorithmic process is what Dennett in particular, but Dawkins too, both adopt, and they think that lays an axe to the root of religion and theology. Theistic evolution, on the other hand, tries to say evolution is not mindless, but it's minded. It's given direction, and it's pulled along in its growth towards a divine end that is appointed by God, and that God is involved in the evolution, in the very process itself, shaping us and shaping the world around us. And I think that's a better way to frame evolution, by saying it's not neutral. That's fine, but here's one interpretation of evolution. And what we have really are two competing interpretations. One that says it's mindless, one that says it's minded, one that's religious, one that's atheist, and they just kind of are rival theories and rival metaphysics that go at it. And we don't have any kind of neutral objective standpoint from which to judge them, so we just see which one sounds more persuasive and aesthetically pleasing and a better narrative about how life might be. And I would rather pick the theistic evolution framework. That's a kind of narrative I think gives meaning to my life, even if I can't disprove the mindless, cold, algorithmic process that hyperdarwinists put forward. So enjoy your review of Dawkins. It's a popular book, hopefully accessible to you. And I'll put the Dennett book up there as well, which I'd recommend reading the first 100 pages of or so. Okay, the next lecture will come